As Mr. Keeble, red-eyed and overwrought, rose slowly from his chair and began to swell in ominous silence, his nephew raised his hand appealingly. It began to occur to the Freddie that he had perhaps not led up to his request with the maximum of smooth tact. "Oh, half a jiffy," he entreated. "I say, don't go off in the deep end just for a second. I can explain." Mr. Keeble's feelings expressed themselves in a loud snort. "Explain?" "Well, I can. The whole trouble was, I started at the wrong end. Shouldn't have sprung it on you like that. Fact is, Uncle Joe, I've got a scheme. I give you my word that if you'll only put off having apoplexy for about 3 minutes," said Freddie, scanning his fermenting relative with some anxiety, "I can shove you onto a good thing, honestly I can. And all I say is, if this scheme I'm talking about is worth 1,000 quid to you, will you slip it across? I'm game to spill it and leave it to your honesty to cash up if the thing looks good for you." £1,000? "Nice round sum," urged Freddie ingratiatingly. "Why," demanded Mr. Keeble, now somewhat recovered, "do you want £1,000? "Well, who doesn't, if it comes to that," said Freddie. "But I don't mind telling you my special reason for wanting it at just this moment. If you'll swear to keep it under your hat as far as the governor's concerned." "If you mean that you wish me not to repeat to your father anything you may tell me in confidence, naturally I should not dream of doing such a thing." Freddie looked puzzled. His was no lightning brain. "Can't quite work that out," he confessed. "Do you mean you will tell him? Or you won't?" "I will not tell him." "Oh, good old Uncle Joe," said Freddie, relieved. "A topper. I've always said so. Well, look here. You know all the trouble there's been about my dropping a bit on the races lately." "I do." "Between ourselves, I dropped about 500 of the best. And I just want to ask you one simple question. Why did I drop it?" "Because you're an infernal young ass." "Well, yes," agreed Freddie, having considered the point. "You might put it that way, of course, but why was I an ass?" "Good God!" exclaimed the exasperated Mr. Keeble. "Am I a psychoanalyst?" "I mean to say, if you come right down to it, I lost all that stuff simply because I was on the wrong side of the fence. It's a mug's game betting on horses. The only way to make money is to be a bookie. And that's what I'm going to do. If you'll part with that 1,000, pal of mine, who was up at Oxford with me, is in a bookie's office, and they're game to take me in too if I can put up 1,000 quid. Only I must let them know quick, because the offer's not going to be open forever. You've no notion of what a deuce it is, a lot of competition there is for that sort of a job." Mr. Keeble, who had been endeavouring with some energy to get a word in during this harangue, now contrived to speak. "And do you seriously suppose that I would? And what's the use of wasting time talking? I've no means of laying my hands on the sum you mentioned. If I had," said Mr. Keeble wistfully, "if I had—" And his eyes strayed to the letter on the desk, the letter which had got as far as "My dear Phyllis," and stuck there. Freddie gazed upon him with cordial sympathy. "Oh, I know how you're situated, Uncle Joe. I'm dashed sorry for you. I mean, Aunt Constance and all that." "What?" Irksome as Mr. Keeble sometimes found the peculiar condition of his financial arrangements, he had always had the consolation of supposing that they were a secret between his wife and himself. "What do you mean?" "Well, I know that Aunt Constance keeps an eye on the doubloons and checks the outgoings pretty narrowly, and I think it's a dash shame that she won't unbuckle to help poor old Phyllis. A girl," said Freddie, "I always liked." "Bally shame. Why the dickens shouldn't she marry that fellow Jackson? I mean, love's love," said Freddie, who felt strongly on this point. Mr. Keeble was making curious gulping noises. "Perhaps I ought to explain," said Freddie, "that I was having a quiet after-breakfast smoke outside the window there and heard the whole thing. I mean, You and Aunt Constance going to the mat about poor old Phyllis, and you trying to bite the governor's ear and so forth. And Mr. Keeble bubbled for a while. You listened, he managed to ejaculate at length. And dashed lucky for you, said Freddie, with a cordiality unimpaired by the frankly unfriendly stare under which a nicer-minded youth would have withered. Dashed lucky for you that I did, because I've got a scheme. Mr. Keeble's estimate of his young relative's sagacity was not a high one, and it's doubtful whether, had the latter caught him in a less despondent mood, he had wasted time in inquiring into the details of this scheme, the mention of which had been playing in and out of Freddie's conversation like a will-o'-the-wisp. But such was his reduced state at the moment that a reluctant gleam of hope crept into his troubled eye. A scheme? Do you mean a scheme to help me out of my difficulty? Absolutely. You want the best seats? We have them. I mean, Freddie went on, interpretation of these peculiar words. You want 3,000 quid? I can show you how to get it. Then kindly do so, said Mr. Keeble, and having opened the door, peered cautiously out and closed sharply on the chest. If a husband pinches anything... closed it sharply again. He crossed the room and shut the window. Makes it a bit fuggy, but perhaps you're right, said Freddie, eyeing these manoeuvres. Well, it's like this, Uncle Joe. You remember what you were saying to Aunt Constance about some bird being apt to sneak up and pinch her necklace? I do. Well, why not? What do you mean? I mean, why don't you? Mr. Keeble regarded his nephew with unconcealed astonishment. He had been prepared for imbecility, but this exceeded his expectations. Steal my wife's necklace? That's it. Frightfully quick you are getting on to an idea. Pinch Aunt Connie's necklace? For, mark you, continued Freddie, so far forgetting the respect due from a nephew as to tap his uncle sharply on the chest. If a husband pinches anything from a wife, it isn't stealing. That's law. I found that out from a movie I saw in town. The Hon. Freddie was a great student of the movies. He could tell a superfilm from a superfilm at a glance, and what he did not know about erring wives and licentious clubmen could have been written in a subtitle. Are you insane? Growled Mr. Keeble. It wouldn't be hard for you to get hold of it, and once you've got it, everybody would be happy. I mean, all you'd have to do would be to draw a cheque to pay for another one for Aunt Connie, which would make her perfectly chirpy, as well as putting you one up, if you follow me. Then you would have the other necklace, the pinched one, to play about with. See what I mean? You could sell it privily, and by stealth ship Phyllis her 3,000, push across my 1,000, and what was left over would be a nice little private account for you to tuck away somewhere where Aunt Connie wouldn't know anything about it. And a dashed useful thing, said Freddie, to have up your sleeve in case of emergencies. Are you... Mr. Keeble was on the point of repeating his previous remark, when suddenly there came the realization that, despite all preconceived opinions, the young man was anything but insane. The scheme at which he had been prepared to scoff was so brilliant, yet simple, that it seemed almost incredible that its sponsor could have worked it out for himself. Not my own, said Freddie modestly, as if in answer to the thought. Saw much the same thing in a movie once. Only there was a fellow, if I remember, wanted to do down an insurance company, and it wasn't a necklace he pinched, but bonds. Still, the principle's the same. Well, how do we go, Uncle Joe? How about it? Is that worth 1,000 quid or not? Even though he had seen in person to the closing of the door and the window, Mr. Keeble could not refrain from a conspirator-like glance about him. They had been speaking with lowered voices, but now words came from him in an almost inaudible whisper. Could it really be done? Is it feasible? Feasible? Why, dash it, what the dickens is there to stop you? You could do it in a second. And the beauty of the whole thing is that if you were copped, nobody would say a word, because husband pinching from his wife isn't stealing. Law. The statement that in the circumstances indicated nobody could say a word seemed to Mr. Keeble so at variance with the facts that he was compelled to challenge it. Your aunt would have a good deal to say, he observed ruefully. Oh, yes, I see what you mean. Well, you'd have to risk that. After all, the chances would be dead against her finding out. But she might. Oh, well, if you put it like that, I suppose she might. Freddie, my boy, said Mr. Keeble weakly, I daren't do it. The vision of his £1,000 slipping from his grasp so wrought upon Freddie that he expressed himself in a manner far from fitting in one of his years towards an older man. Oh, I say, don't be such a rabbit. Mr. Keeble shook his head. No, he repeated, I daren't. It might have seemed that the negotiations had reached a deadlock, but Freddie, with £1,000 in sight, was in far too stimulated a condition to permit so tame an ending to such a promising plot. As he stood there, chafing at his uncle's pusillanimity, an idea was vouchsafed to him. By Jove, I'll tell you what, he cried. Not so loud, moaned the apprehensive Mr. Keeble. Not so loud. I'll tell you what, repeated Freddie in a hoarse whisper. How would it be if I did the pinching? What? How would you? Hope, which had vanished from Mr. Keeble's face, came flooding back. My boy, would you really? For £1,000, you bet I would. Mr. Keeble clutched at his young relative's hand, gripped it feverishly. Freddie, he said, the moment you place that necklace in my hands, I will give you not £1,000, but £2,000. Uncle Joe, said Freddie with equal intensity, it's a bet. Mr. Keeble mopped at his forehead. You think you can manage it? Manage it? Freddie laughed a light laugh. Ha ha! Just watch me. Mr. Keeble grasped his hand again with the utmost warmth. I must go out and get some air, he said. I'm all upset. May I really leave this matter to you, Freddie? Rather. Good. Then tonight I'll write to Phyllis and say that I may be able to do what she wishes. Don't say may, cried Freddie buoyantly. The word is will. Bally will. What-ho?